Welcome back to the EdEquity VA webinar series. My name is Janae Nurse, and I am the Equity Coordinator here at the Virginia Department of Education. I am so glad that you all are joining us this afternoon for this conversation. I will be facilitating it, and we'll be talking about culturally responsive and inclusive lessons around 9/11. As we approach the 20th anniversary, we want to ensure that Virginia educators and leaders are prepared to facilitate conversations around the events of that day and the aftermath with students in a way that is inclusive and responsive to diverse students in our classrooms. The VDOE continues to be committed to ensuring safe and inclusive school and classroom environments through a commitment to culturally responsive practice. Culturally responsive practice requires us as educators to understand students' lived experiences and how they impact learning. That knowledge and intentionality allows educators to be responsive to student needs and inclusive of their experiences, especially when discussing challenging subjects. Today's webinar is meant to continue to build equity consciousness and culturally responsive practice so that all students feel a sense of membership and belonging at all times in school. Our presenter will provide some context for what culturally responsive and inclusive teaching is, related research findings, and considerations and best practices for engaging students in lessons focused on 9/11 in a way that does not cause harm. And before we do that, I'm going to invite our newly named Assistant Superintendent for Equity, Dr. Rosa Atkins, to join us on the mic to provide brief remarks to reiterate the VDOE's commitment to inclusive education. And Dr. Atkins recently joined our team, and it really just speaks to our commitment to equity here at the DOE. We're accelerating the work, elevating the work to the highest levels at the agency, and we are certainly happy to have Dr. Atkins on board. Dr. Atkins, it is all yours.
Janae, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be a part of such a vibrant team. We all know that Janae Nurse and Leah Walker have worked tirelessly around the topic of equity, providing resources to the field and supporting the work in the field. So thank you for providing the foundation, the structures that we need in order to move this work forward. And to each one of you, your presence here today shows your commitment to equity and making sure that you have in your toolkit the resources and the repertoire that is necessary in order to respond to the needs of the young people that you service in your schools and in your classrooms. Understanding the individual perspectives, understanding the perspectives of our students, of our staff, to everyone who is in our organization is a vital part of equity. Then the series of webinars that we are hosting is intended to give you additional resources to consider as you're developing your culturally responsive practices and instruction to help you to be relevant as you develop and talk with and change our cultures, to make sure that all of our young people, all of our staff, all of the people in the Commonwealth of Virginia feel valued and a part of the success that we are having and will have in the future. So thank you, Janae. Thank you, Leah, for all that you have done. And Dr. DeCur, thank you for being here with us. We are delighted to have you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Atkins. And before we introduce today's presenter, I do want to go over a couple of brief reminders. Today's webinar is being recorded and it will be posted to the Virginia Department of Education YouTube channel, as well as our Virginia is for Learners website, and that'll be available for public access. I will also email the recording of the webinar as well as the slides to everybody that has registered today. And do feel empowered to share those with your colleagues as you see fit. We want that to be a resource for as many people as possible. I also want to let you all know that today we will be taking questions and answers through the Q&A feature in Zoom. We will not open up the chat just so that we can keep track of everything. If you have any questions throughout this webinar, please do ask them using that Q&A feature. And now I am happy to introduce Dr. Amara DeCure. educator, researcher, and inclusive pedagogy fellow at American University in the School of Education, and an executive board member at the Center for Islam and the Contemporary World at Shenandoah University. Her scholarship spans the areas of anti-racist pedagogy, Muslim student experiences, equity, anti-racism, education leadership, teacher education, and faculty development. So we are certainly in for a treat to have a very well-respected scholar in her field joining us to present on this topic. And so at this time, I am more than delighted to turn it over to Dr. Amara DeCure.
Thank you. Thank you, Janae. Thank you, Dr. Atkins, for extending this invitation to be a part of Virginia Department of Education's EdEquity series. I appreciate your commitment to amplifying these urgent issues of equity in our presentation that we're going to have today. To Dr. Rosa Atkins, welcome as our new Assistant Superintendent for Equity. And Janae, my sincere thanks and appreciation to you for being able to identify an urgent issue of equity and create this opportunity in lightning speed. I'd also like to thank Virginia's Secretary of Education, Atif Carney, for his leadership and support of this work. Although he was unable to attend this webinar live, I appreciate the opportunity I had to share my scholarship with him in advance of this presentation. And to my colleagues on the Culturally Relevant and Inclusive Practices Advisory Committee, thank you. Thank you for inspiring me to amplify the voices of students across the Commonwealth who have contributed to my project. I dedicate my scholarship to them, the students who demonstrate a commitment to making their identities visible in their schools and in their communities. They are the motivation for my presentation this afternoon. Today, I'm going to represent to you all some of my research, my findings, and my assertions around culturally responsive teaching, inclusive practices, and teaching about 9/11 in a way that does not reproduce harm for our students. My views and opinions are mine and don't reflect the views and opinions of the Virginia Department of Education. And as I begin today, I'd like to start with a little technological transition here. And I think we are set and everything is looking really good right here. So today's topic I have titled as Culturally Responsive and Inclusive 9/11 Commemorations. This topic is important because we are approaching the 20th anniversary of September 11th, where it is my anticipation, and it's probably shared by many of you, that when America has an anniversary that ends in zeros or fives, it creates a great deal of public discourse and conversation. And as teachers and leaders in our public schools, we do best work when we respond to the contemporary issues that our students are navigating. And so as we know our students are going to begin to navigate larger conversations in society about September 11th, we need to be prepared to meet those students in the classroom with strong instructional practices. And I would like to begin by naming that culturally responsive and inclusive teaching practices are the best representation of instruction that we need today. And we can deploy these practices when planning our September 11th commemorations in ways that support the learning of all of our students. So welcome to this presentation. Today, I would like to accomplish a few things on our agenda. One, be able to name the context of culturally responsive and inclusive teaching. I'd like to share with you 6 key tenets that I teach at American University to help our teacher candidates better understand what it means to be a culturally responsive educator. Then I'd like to introduce you to some early findings of research I've been conducting for the past 2 years on Muslim students. The research and the findings are directly relevant to the work that we need to do as we prepare for 9/11 lesson plans. I'd like to remind us to consider what are the implications for the 20th anniversary of 9/11 and how should that show up in our lessons. We have instructional standards here in the Commonwealth of Virginia about September 11th, and I'd like to share those with you, as well as share some other instructional standards that will guide our presentation this afternoon. I then would like us to take what we know to be the best practices of culturally responsive and inclusive teaching and apply it to lesson design ideas for 9/11. And consistent with a great professional development space, I would like to invite you to do some self-reflective activities with me towards the end of the presentation. And then I want to share resources, because whenever educators come together and have a great conversation about teaching and learning, it always ends with sharing resources. And so I want to honor that relationship with all of you this afternoon. So I'd like to also suggest that we have some ins and outs, some agreements as we get into this conversation, because teaching about 9/11 is difficult. Talking about 9/11 is also very challenging. So I'd like to suggest some things that are going to be in this conversation today. We're going to extend an expectation of equity for all of our learners across the Commonwealth of Virginia and beyond. We're going to begin and end with an understanding that each of these students deserves to experience an equitable learning environment in their classroom. We're going to humanize our Muslim students. We're going to be talking about Muslim students in this conversation today. And so as we talk about them, we're going to focus on our common humanity with the Muslim students in our care. We're going to acknowledge the existence of anti-Muslim racism. That's going to be important as we begin to plan our 9/11 lessons in a way that does not seek to reproduce anti-Muslim racism. And because we are gathered together as a group of educators, let's come together with the spirit of seeking to learn and be in a learning community with one another. As I tell my students in class, you don't come to school seeking to show off what you know. You come to class seeking to learn and to gain information. So be in this community as a learner. Ask your questions in a spirit of wanting to know more and hope to seek and find the answers you are coming with. So what's out? We are not going to reproduce a false assumption of Muslim responsibility for 9/11. We're just going to begin right there and name that there is no responsibility, and therefore we're not going to use this space to try and untangle that. We're also not going to use this space to reproduce anti-Muslim rhetoric. There's no time, place for that in our world, and there's not going to be a time or place for that in this space. We're also not going to use this space to get into an analysis of US foreign policy. There are other times, places, and opportunities for people to have that conversation, but not for today, not in this moment. And we're also not going to reproduce what's understood as American exceptionalism. This understanding that America is a land at the top of a beautiful mountain and that all other countries, nations, and people are less than America. We're not going to reproduce notions that American history and American experiences are more significant than the experiences or histories of other people. So we're going to begin with a common understanding of our shared humanity, regardless of our national, racial, linguistic, religious origins. So let's talk about teaching. Let's talk about culturally responsive and inclusive teaching. And there's much that you can read about this topic, particularly today. There's a great deal of scholarship of what it means to be a culturally responsive and what it means to be an inclusive educator. So there's work from the Association for Supervision, Curriculum, and Development that has recently published an article that narrows this practice down to 6 key tenets. And these 6 key tenets help best represent the umbrella of what it means to engage as a culturally responsive educator. I'd like to go over these briefly and hope that they serve as a reminder for all of you. But if these are unfamiliar teaching practices or an unfamiliar framework, I encourage you to read more. I encourage you to look deeper into what it means to be a culturally responsive educator. I think you will find that it enhances significantly the academic and the social experiences in your classroom and in your schools. So 1, Culturally responsive teaching begins with an understanding of how learning takes place. And in culturally responsive pedagogy, the understanding is that learning takes place from a constructivist lens. That means that we as students construct our knowledge by building bridges from what we know to what we are learning. It means that learning takes place when we're invited to construct our own understanding. Learning doesn't tend to take place when we're simply told what we're supposed to know. So culturally responsive teachers teach through inquiry. They encourage students to ask questions. They encourage students to build off of prior knowledge. This is a core foundation of teaching and best practices of instruction. It also includes learning about students' actual lives. And I'm not talking about broad information about the cultural groups that your students may be associated with. I'm talking about the actual lives of the actual, 20, 25, 30 students that might be on your class roster. When you learn about your actual students' lives, you're better able to respond to them as their instructor. And that's what culturally responsive teaching means, responding to the actual needs and priorities of your students and being inclusive to include all of them in your classroom practices. Third, engaging as a socio-culturally responsive teacher. Now, this might be challenging had we not had the benefit of social media, but with all the access that we have to worldviews and perspectives around us, it is our incumbent responsibility to engage as socially, culturally responsive teachers. And that means by recognizing there's not one universal worldview of how people understand the world and make sense of it. There are so many different ways that people understand our world, so many different ways that people experience our world. And so as a conscious educator, we need to be aware of all the different ways that people experience our world, including our students. This is a historical understanding and a present day understanding, so that when we come into the classroom, we are aware of all the social and cultural discourses that explain how our students show up in classroom. Fourth, we must have affirming views about diversity. Now, to be clear, I've met almost every teacher I've met says they champion diversity. Great, but I want you to have an asset-based view of championing diversity and be able to extend it even to the students who are socially or culturally marginalized. Look at your students and find something asset-based about their culture, their way of understanding, the funds of knowledge that they and their families and communities bring into your classroom or your school. Fifth, use appropriate instructional strategies in your classroom. All right, so this is almost some circular logic. Go back to the tenet number 1, use constructivist principles of teaching and allow students to build knowledge off of their prior understandings. Teach them how to lean into instruction by leaning in with inquiry-based strategies. But also appropriate instructional strategies include building community in your classrooms, in your schools. Students learn when they feel safe and when they feel a sense of belonging. So teaching how to build a community is an instructional strategy. Using inclusive language, modeling inclusive attitudes and behaviors is an instructional strategy. Students learn not just by what we write on the whiteboard, they learn by what we say and what we do. And lastly, advocating for all of our students, all of our students. Being a culturally responsive and inclusive teacher means being a champion to every student on your roster, advocating for their best interests at all times, creating instructional practices that support their learning, support their social and emotional growth and well-being. And we often do this in a context in which these behaviors are not rewarded in larger society. So it's not easy being a culturally responsive and inclusive teacher, but I argue it is best practices. It's what we need in our world today. It's what we need in our state today. So let me share with you some of my research, because I need to make the connection between culturally responsive and inclusive teaching and some of the research I've been working on recently. For the past 2 years, I've been working on a research study about Muslim student experiences in public schools. It's important because we don't have a great deal of existing knowledge of how Muslim students experience public schools today. And although the full body of my research is not ready yet for its own webinar, I do want to share some early findings that have come from this study. And that is that Muslim students describe that in their public schools, they experience what's understood as anti-Muslim racism. This might be a term that could be unfamiliar to some of you. And so I'd like to just describe what these students mean when they're communicating anti-Muslim racist experiences in their public schools. It's based on a historical construction of difference and othering. Anti-Muslim racism is not a new phenomenon. It's not an American reality. It is something that is historically relevant. It dates back generations, centuries even, where Muslims were perceived as being different and othered. In today's recent context, it reproduces violent and terrorist stereotypes. Many of these stem from 9/11 itself. Anti-Muslim racism targets Muslims widely. It's irregardless of a Muslim's national origin, the language spoken at home, their socioeconomic status, their level of education, their career, their location, the size and depth of their family. It targets Muslims widely. And in school, these young people describe experiencing anti-Muslim racism as bullying and social exclusion. In fact, research done by the Institute of Social Policy and Understanding names that 2 out of every 5 Muslim families report that their school-age children experience bullying. 2 out of every 5 Muslim families. And 1 out of every 4 of those instances are bullying instances include a classroom teacher. These are very difficult realities that our students are facing, and my work is seeking to amplify these and to disrupt them. But what I have to name is the one day in the school year that these Muslim students name as the most challenging day to attend school as a Muslim student. And that's on September 11th, every year. These students describe that on 9/11 in previous years, when their schools or their classrooms commemorated 9/11, they faced increased anti-Muslim racism. Once I began to see that our students have a pattern of experiencing anti-Muslim racism around 9/11 experiences in previous years, it made it clear to me that as we approach the 20th anniversary commemorating 9/11 this year, it's likely to result in heightened risks of racist discourse, threats, or violence that may target our Muslim students. And so my work is to support educators, because I remain a firm believer that educators are best positioned to disrupt these risks by centering the social and emotional needs of Muslim students as they plan their 9/11 lessons. So I'd like to share with you just 3 examples of what I mean by students experiencing anti-Muslim racism around 9/11 lessons in previous years. One student, who I fictitiously name as Naeem, said, "I remember when they give you that one look, I definitely heard, those remarks like, terrorists. Even if they're joking around, they'll say terrorists and stuff like that. That used to trigger me a lot." When you look at Naeem's response, notice that he ends his statement by saying it used to trigger him. Listen for the emotional toll that this experience is taking on this young man. The second student whose comments I'll share, I fictitiously name as Ahmed. He said, 9/11, every single year is so awkward. The administrators would be like, on this fateful day, this happened. then the Muslim jokes would come up, like, don't blow us up, don't do this. When I was younger, it bothered me, but now I'm just desensitized to it. Again, when you hear Ahmed's comment, he describes experiencing this as a younger student when it was bothering him and not able to do anything or make sense of it. And after years and years of experiencing it, he is now naming it as being desensitized. Or a third student in the study, fictitiously named as Kareem, said, there's so much tension, just being even this color, and then being a Muslim, period. It's really strange, like you feel it. They're not saying it. You don't understand this question because you're Muslim, which is the strangest thing, but it's definitely the tension that these teachers give off sometimes. And again, for Kareem, what you hear in this statement is an expression of the tension in the classroom that is impacting him and how he's emotionally responding in this moment.
Dr. DeKira,
Janae?
we did have a question that came up that I think is relevant to answer now.
Please.
In your research, how was bullying defined for respondents?
Excellent. So the examples that you see on the screen explain or describe some of the bullying experiences that these students mentioned. Having students whisper or name words like terrorists to them in the classroom when the teacher is teaching a lesson at the front of the board. I have had students describe passing through a hallway and having students say terrorists or whispering, don't bomb us as they walk through the hallway. Those are the bullying experiences that these students describe in and around September 11th. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to put a poll up on the screen. And the poll that I'm going to put up now is going to ask you, what should we do as educators in response to these student experiences? Using Naeem, Ahmed, and Kareem's examples, what should we now do as classroom educators or leaders in response to these experiences? If you can read the 6 different options that are on the screen in front of you, click as many as you think are appropriate, and then I'd like to share the responses and discuss these with all of you today. You know, a great professional development workshop has a bit of engagement, and you have to excuse the awkward formality of a Zoom poll as the way in which we're going to make a proxy for a virtual engagement here with all of you. So right now we've got about 20% of the participants clicking into the poll. I'm going to wait a few moments and hope that we can get that up to closer to 75, if not more, of you offering your ideas and opinions. Excellent. Excellent. We're getting up there. We've got about 55% of the room that has been able to click into a response. I'm going to share these results and talk about them with all of you. So the largest response that's receiving 96% of the room is that we should develop culturally responsive and inclusive teaching strategies to teach about 9/11. And I agree with you. I mean, that's the purpose of this conversation today. And I hope that by the end of this conversation, we will have the resources and expanded capacity to be able to develop those lessons for our classroom instruction in just a few weeks. The second strongest response that we had is to increase awareness about Muslim student experiences. I strongly agree with this. You know, as I was doing this work, the next step that I took after finding these student comments is to begin to talk about these with local district leaders. And the response that I had, most consistent response was, I didn't know. I just didn't know that students were having these experiences in our classrooms. And so I think that by talking about them, increasing our awareness, then we're able to hold ourselves to doing something different for this year in a way that does not reproduce harm in our classroom lessons. The next most common response is to implement our anti-bullying policies. Absolutely. We have statewide policies that are on the books. We can use them. When we are made aware of bullying in our schools or in our classrooms, and we need to deploy them, use them. That's why we have the policies there. The next most common response was to monitor our Muslim students to identify anti-Muslim racism. So I understand the sentiment here is that is, if we're going to look for anti-Muslim racism in order to disrupt it, we need to look in the place where it's most likely to orbit, and that would be around our Muslim students. But the word monitor in here would cause an educator to have a hyper focus on his or her Muslim students around 9/11. And what some of our students in the study have shared is that they feel as if people are already staring at them in these lessons. When the teacher begins to talk about 9/11, the students describe that they feel their teacher is staring directly at them. They describe that they feel their classmates are staring at them. And so students already attend the school day feeling like they're hyper focused on and hyper identified. So I would encourage you to observe for anti-Muslim racism without having a hyper vigilant, hyper focused view of staring or observing or even monitoring your Muslim students in their interactions, but rather observing the students who you feel need to be supported in having more equitable peer experiences in and around 9/11. There's less interest from from this webinar of excusing Muslim students from 9/11 instruction days. And I agree, right? We should be striving to make every one of our school days a day where all of our students feel welcome, a sense of belonging, and an opportunity to learn. And creating opportunities for students, or teachers rather, to simply excuse students who feel that they might be marginalized without pairing it with excellent teaching falls short of our expectations for our students. And no, we don't want to minimize our 9/11 instruction to reduce negative student impact. 9/11 is part of our learning standards. It's part of our social discourse, particularly this year. And so as educators, we do need to lean into what is going to be talked about in our communities and make sure that we support students in the classroom to navigate those experiences. So this next screen here shares what I wanted to do with the research findings as they became clear to me. One, I wanted to increase awareness. And that's part of the reason why I'm so appreciative of having this opportunity to be in this webinar with all of you today. The second, I do encourage our school leaders to prepare the staff around them to disrupt this racism by implementing existing district and state anti-bullying policies. We already have what we need on the books to disrupt this. We just need to be prepared to use it. And then lastly, I think that our leaders can help support teachers to have inclusive instructional plans to be able to commemorate the significance of this date in our nation's history. And I hope that this webinar provides some of those resources needed to engage in this work effectively. Now, some of you may say, I'm a bit skeptical. Dr. DeCure, I don't know that this year is going to be that much more difficult. I don't know that we need to be taking such a hyper focus on having culturally responsive and inclusive plans for 9/11 just because it's the 20th anniversary. So I'll share with you some news that just came out a couple days ago. The Department of Homeland Security is warning of heightened risk for the attacks ahead of the 9/11 anniversary. This is our federal government, right? So with all the intelligence that they have, they are preparing us as a national community that there may be heightened risks surrounding the 20th anniversary of 9/11. It's just another reminder that we need to take this approaching anniversary with a degree of understanding that it is creating heightened emotional concerns and risks for our students and our communities. So when we approach the lessons of this day, we approach them with the sensitivity that we need to be effective educators. So there are some standards of learning that we have here in Virginia that make it obligatory to teach about 9/11. And really, these are the standards associated with those that teach US history between 9th and 12th grade. The standard from Virginia reads, the student will apply social science skills to understand political and social conditions in the United States during the early 21st century by evaluating and explaining the changes in foreign policies and the role of the United States in a world confronted by international terrorism, with emphasis on the American response to 9/11. So these are our history and social studies standards. And I'd like you to notice that it says to understand political and social conditions in the United States. So we need to teach about all of that, right? Teaching about 9/11 is not simply teaching what happened on the day of September 11th, 2001, but teaching about the political and the social environment that preceded that day. I also amplify and uplift the terms evaluating and explaining. We know as educators that when students are tasked in an inquiry-centered environment with evaluating material and being able to explain it and represent their knowledge, it creates a higher level of understanding for the content that the students are being presented. Lastly, notice that the standard ends with naming an emphasis on the American response to 9/11. If you pair that with the earlier terminology, it can be an American response that is political and an American response that is social. So including a wide understanding of the American response will help our students have a more complex understanding of September 11th. Second, SEL, social emotional learning. We have social emotional learning goals here in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And the vision of these goals is to maximize the potential of all students and staff to become responsible, caring, and reflective members of our diverse society by advancing equity, uplifting student voice, and infusing social emotional learning into every part of the school experience. So when we're teaching about 9/11, we're teaching students about a very challenging part of American history and giving them the tools that they can manage through the social experiences surrounding the 20th anniversary and the emotional responses that are likely to be unearthed during the 20th anniversary. So as educators, we need to be prepared to both teach and respond to the social and emotional needs of our students. And lastly, we have a goal in Virginia to promote equity. And this is about sharing the best practices and practical resources that advance the critical competencies necessary to achieve education equity in Virginia. Courageous leadership, compassionate family and student engagement, continuous reflection, cultural responsiveness, and curriculum reframing. So that when we approach teaching about September 11th, equity remains our target and our focus, so that all of our students have an equitable learning experience on this day and in these lessons particularly. Our commitment to education equity needs to remain constant. So let's talk about teaching of that day itself, teaching about 9/11. And I'd like to ask you, and I'm going to ask you here, and Janae, if you could help me find my second poll question.
Yep, I got you.
Perfect. I'd like to ask you, what are the challenges surrounding teaching 9/11? There, perfect. The question is now on the screen. What makes teaching on 9/11 challenging? And I'll pause for a moment to allow you to read the different responses and provide the answers that best reflect what you feel makes teaching this particular topic challenging. Good. We've got about 30, 40% of the room that has been able to respond. We'll allow it to get up to closer to the 60 that we had before. Very good. All right, so as you can see on the screen, the majority, and it's a smaller majority than what we had from the previous poll. This is a 66% majority of the room, says teaching about devastation and loss is always challenging. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Let's acknowledge that. Teaching about devastation and loss is challenging. But we have resources to be able to support us. We as teachers have taught about devastation and loss in many other historical contexts. Just think about everything that is on your roster, on your agenda of what you're going to be teaching this coming academic school year. There are many opportunities where we have to teach about devastation and loss. So I'd like you to acknowledge it. Don't shy away from that. But at the same time that you acknowledge it, remind yourself that you have the capacity to teach about difficult subjects when you're presented with the resources that allow you to do that effectively. Paired to that is the second most common response of the room. It is a politically charged moment in American history. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. And again, we have to acknowledge that. If we walk into a lesson about 9/11, politically naive, thinking that there's only one way that people understand this day, then it reproduces this false understanding that there's only one worldview, and there isn't. That's why a socially conscious teacher understands there's multiple perspectives. The other most common response, 38% of the room says there's a lack of suitable lesson resources. Yes, there is. I'm grateful to have a graduate student at American University who supported me this past 2 weeks, scouring the internet to find 9/11 lesson plans. I'm going to be sharing those with you this afternoon. But there is a lack of suitable lesson resources. So for teachers out there who are gifted in writing culturally responsive lesson plans, you have a body of educators who are waiting for you to make those publicly available. Let's also acknowledge 36% of the room is saying they have emotional responses to this day. And that's what makes teaching challenging. I want to honor that. Let's make space for that. We are the adults in the room who lived through 9/11. We each have memories of being on that day, emotionally experiencing that day and the 20 years of emotions that have come after that day. So as adults preparing to go into our classrooms and schools, we need to make sure that we create space for us to process our emotional responses to 9/11. The 20th anniversary is not going to be easy. There's going to be a lot of conversations, a lot of visual images, a lot of bringing up of those emotions. So find opportunities either in your family, in your community, in your schools, where adults can gather together to emotionally process our adult reactions and responses to this day. When we are able to process our own emotions, we're better able to be present for the needs of our students. About a quarter of the room is saying our students are too young to appreciate the significance of this day. I understand that. All the students we're teaching were born less than 20 years ago. But I challenge you. Some of our students may appreciate the significance of this day, not because they witnessed it, but because their families witnessed an experience of loss. Or maybe because their families witnessed an experience of survival and resilience. Maybe those students and their families continue to be burdened with fears of personal safety stemming from 9/11. So even if our students are too young to have borne witness with their own eyes, they may not be too young to appreciate the significance of this day. And there's only a couple people in the room who say they don't find it difficult to teach on 9/11. And I'm going to trust that those colleagues of ours on this call have a wealth of resources at their hands to be able to implement culturally responsive and inclusive teaching practices. Because when you have the resources you need, we hope that it will be less difficult to teach about 9/11 on the 20th anniversary of 9/11. So I'm going to share with you some content that can support you in teaching about 9/11, particularly the content to help you make sense verbally of what happened on that day. I know that when I try and talk about 9/11 without rehearsing my words in advance when speaking to a child, I often trip over my own tongue because I'm concerned about saying too much or too little, frightening them or not giving them enough details. So when we talk about 9/11 and the events of that day, it is important to use accurate terminology. Name this as a foreign attack. That's what it was. It was a foreign attack on American soil. Name this as an attack caused by extremists. If we fail to name who caused the attack of 9/11, the students themselves will fill in the gaps of what we don't say with things from their own imagination. There's a lot of discourse out there. There's a lot of content, a lot of media stuff out there that names who's responsible for 9/11 that's either not accurate or racist. You'll also know that I'm using the word extremist in my terminology, not the word terrorist. I want to name why I'm saying this. The word terrorist in our American recent contemporary experiences have often been directly paralleled with casualties and trauma that have been inflicted by people who proclaim to be Muslim or practitioners of the Islamic faith. Whenever we see a reality of mass casualties, mass violence, mass productions of fear caused by people who do not identify as Muslim, we often name it with other words, other traumas, other violences. We don't often name it as terrorism. And so in order to help disrupt this false equivalency of Muslims and terrorism, I choose to use the word extremists. And I use this based on the scholarship of other scholars and activists in the community that will also use this word to describe the perpetrators of the crimes associated with 9/11. I also name that 9/11 is an event that caused significant damage, loss, and destruction to our American sites. The World Trade Center, the Pentagon are two of the sites that we need to name for our students. But I want to remind you, as teachers, it's our responsibility to determine the relevant details of 9/11. The best practices we have of education tell us to create an inquiry-based classroom to respond to students' needs, to also be aware of child development. So for the teachers in our room who teach preschool, kindergarten, first grade, second grade, I hope that you do not need to teach the events of 9/11. If a young child asks you what happened on that day, name it as a foreign attack and stop talking. And just see if the child has questions or concerns that you need to address. But when we're teaching 3rd grade through 12th grade and our students are asking us more direct, more complex questions, determine what is relevant information for them to know. Unfortunately, I was made aware of an example in a classroom some years ago where a teacher distributed a worksheet and asked the students to write the names of the extremists who caused 9/11. That is not a relevant detail. It is not relevant information at all. So as culturally responsive educators, determine what do our students need to be able to bridge their current understanding to a greater level of complexity, and that's the lane and the zone in which we teach. When we talk about loss, and loss is going to come as a conversation in 9/11, we need to humanize the 3,000 lives that were lost on 9/11. Don't just name a number. Humanize them. Name that these were mothers, fathers, aunts, uncles, grandparents, children, siblings, co-workers, and friends. But also, as you humanize the lives lost, make visible that almost 60 Muslims also lost their life on 9/11. It helps to disrupt this understanding that Muslims are not mourning the loss of people who died on 9/11, because it's members of Muslim families who also lost their lives in the World Trade Center or in the Pentagon that day. Describe the structural loss at the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, but also name how from that loss has come the 9/11 Memorial Museum. And prepare for the varied emotional responses that may come in your classroom as a result of talking about loss. Some of your students will be emotionally distraught, and you're going to need to be prepared to support them. Other students may not have a visible emotional response, and you're going to need to support them that it is okay that no matter how they show up emotionally, that you can help support them in learning what this day involved and what this day means. If we as teachers don't help make this information clear, our students are going to be left with a Google search, a TikTok search, an Instagram feed in order to give them the information they're looking for. Heroism. Make heroism visible when you talk about 9/11. We know that there were stories of heroism that shone on that day, but tell culturally diverse stories of heroism. Talk about the first responders. Name the men and the women who are heroes on that day, and show that they came from all different races as American first responders. Talk about the civilians, the ones who stepped up and offered to help on that day. And the community leaders, the ones in New York City, the ones around the Pentagon, the ones around the nation, are community leaders who stood up on that day as heroes and brought us comfort and solace. Tell the story of resistance through the story of Flight 93. They have a great website online with teaching resources. But when we teach about 9/11, I want to remind you, you don't have to stop with the story of loss. You can teach about heroism, the American heroism that shone through on that day. Now, I also would like to give you some advice and some reminders that when you talk about heroism, to make it a culturally responsive conversation. So in the top left-hand screen, you're going to see an image of a video on YouTube. Great video, highly encourage you to view it. It's called The Man in the Red Bandana. It's a great story about a young man who was a firefighter and then took an office job in the World Trade Center. On the day of 9/11, he was in the World Trade Center, and as the planes crashed into the building, he began to help escort people down an internal staircase so that they could find safety. And then he would go back up again to escort more people down. And he did this over and over until the buildings crashed and he lost his own life. It's a very powerful story of heroism. But I'd also like you to look at the image to your right. This is a Black Muslim man who's a first responder, who was there on 9/11, supporting and helping. When you tell the stories of heroism, include Muslims in those stories. That will serve to help disrupt the anti-Muslim racism that continues to be tethered to 9/11. And in the middle, you see a young man who was a New York Police Department cadet. His name is Salman Hamdani. If you're not familiar with his story, I invite you to go to StoryCorps and be able to find a story about him. He was a young man. He wasn't even on duty as a cadet on the day of 9/11. But when he saw the smoke coming from the site of the World Trade Center, he rushed toward the building in an act of service. He lost his life that day as a first responder at 9/11. Today, his hometown, Bayside, Queens, has renamed a street in his honor. He's a Muslim American who was serving the New York police force as a first responder that day. So I encourage you, when you tell stories of heroism, tell a culturally diverse story of heroism that spans the American landscape. It will help our students better understand the power of community that erupted on this day. And then talk about the days and the weeks right after 9/11. Don't just stop with the day of. This image that you see on the screen is of President Bush. And I'd like to remind you the importance of presidential remarks. They carry great symbolism. President Bush is making these remarks in the Islamic Center of Washington, D.C., making these remarks days after 9/11. The context is relevant. The location is relevant. And he's surrounded by some of our Muslim community leaders. I recognize them in this video, in this image. President Bush's words say, "The face of terror is not the true faith of Islam. That's not what Islam is all about. Islam is peace. Those terrorists don't represent peace. They represent evil and war. When we think of Islam, we think of a faith that brings comfort to 1 billion people around the world. Billions of people find comfort and solace and peace. And that's made brothers and sisters out of every race, America counts millions of Muslims amongst our citizens, and Muslims make an incredibly valuable contribution to our country. Muslims are doctors, lawyers, law professors, members of the military, entrepreneurs, shopkeepers, moms and dads, and they need to be treated with respect. In our anger and emotion, our fellow Americans must treat each other with respect." For those of you that remember President Bush making these remarks, he did this because days and weeks after 9/11, there was an eruption of anti-Muslim racism, violence, hatred, and bigotry. And President Bush wanted to stand up and disrupt that. Name this in your lesson. This was a powerful presidential message sent to not just comfort our nation after 9/11, but to redirect our social discourse to seeing our shared common American humanity. Days and weeks later, the federal government also created a program called Community Resilience. I remember it. At the time, I was a community resilience leader in in Fairfax County, Virginia, right after September 11th. So in the winter of 2001, going into the spring of 2002. And our community resilience program was tasked with federal funding to create a local impact. We offered mental and behavioral health resources for people that were suffering after September 11th. We offered food and basic necessities for people who lost their job after 9/11. Remember, the increased bias and hatred in our community after 9/11 caused people to lose their jobs and create stress on their families. People had fear of personal safety just leaving the house after 9/11, particularly Muslim Americans who felt that with the increased anti-Muslim sentiment, their own life was at risk leaving their home. Immigrants needed support with job placement because there was increased anti-immigrant bias and discrimination. So the Community Resilience Program sought to create local impact and create new opportunities for people in community to rebuild after the destruction of 9/11. Teach about the civilian efforts for the American Red Cross. Remember the people lining up to donate blood. This was civilians trying to be involved and engaged to show that they were trying to resist the social impact to create divisions in our community. They wanted to create unity and connections. Talk about the interfaith dialogues that spiked right after 9/11. I was a part of them. This erupted because we were having anti-Muslim and anti-immigrant bias and discrimination. And so the interfaith community sought to address this by coming together in dialogue with people of other faiths. This is a very powerful beginning for us as a nation. And for many of us, we continue in this interfaith dialogue today. And then the picture to the right, it's from Brooklyn, New York. And I had to find this picture because New York City reminds me of our nation's urban space where people come from all different nations around the world, speaking all different languages around the world. And the people of New York represent resilience right after 9/11. They represent coming together as community, despite differences. The New Yorkers became our leaders after 9/11, and the rest of the nation sought to follow them. These are the stories I would encourage you to tell as you teach about September 11th with your students. But then we also have to teach the impacts of 9/11. It's important because when we return back to the standards of learning here in the Commonwealth, we have standards of learning that talk about teaching about change, the political change, the policy changes, the changing roles of America, the American responses to 9/11. So when you're teaching about 9/11, teach the 20 years that followed, not simply just the day of. So when we look at the 20 years of impact, there are many different things that we need to be teaching to our students. Let's talk about fear, because fear is a direct impact from 9/11. We had many phobias that stemmed from that day. There were people who were fearful of tall buildings, people who were fearful of planes, people who were fearful of being in large groups. But I would also want you to make visible the fear that people had of their personal safety. Because as anti-Muslim racism spiked after 9/11, you had people who were Muslim and people who were perceived to be Muslim, Sikhs and Hindus, who were fearful of their personal safety days, weeks, and even years after 9/11. In fact, on September the 15th, in the state of Texas, Mr. Balbir Singh Sodhi, a Sikh American, lost his life because he was perceived as being Muslim and he was victim of an anti-Muslim attack stemming from 9/11 backlash. You can learn about his story also on StoryCorps. So when the standards of learning ask us to teach about the social conditions in the United States that stem from September 11th, teach a wide understanding of fear. Don't just leave it at one type of fear that stemmed from 9/11, but teach about the great complexity of fears. Teach also about federal policies, because the federal policies reflect the political conditions before and immediately after and years after September 11th. So teach about the immigration policies, because we know that immigration policies in this nation after 9/11 became tethered with issues of national security. Before that, and for those of you that teach in world history and US history, you can teach about the 1965 Immigration Act, and that those issues were tethered with issues of economics, social services, education opportunities, workplace necessities. But it was because of 9/11 that our immigration policies then began to be tethered to national security issues. Teach about the Muslim ban from 2017. It was passed, it was upheld in federal courts for years. That's a federal policy that stems from the 20-year impact from 9/11. Teach about the US Patriot Act. It's a federal policy. It was born right after 9/11 in an attempt to disrupt violent extremism, both in America and abroad. But then teach about how the US Patriot Act has been disproportionately used to target Muslim American communities in our places of worship, in our community institutions, our nonprofit organizations, and in our student groups on college campuses. Teach our students that the federal government reorganized after 9/11 to create the Department of Homeland Security. Right? This is when we mobilize different federal resources and put them under this new department as a response to 9/11. Teach about the Transportation Safety Administration. Teach about their new charges after 9/11, the enhanced security that we all experience when walking through an airport. Make that visible to students so that they understand that events in history create federal policy changes that we experience in day-to-day life. But also teach your students that TSA created after 9/11 what is called as a no-fly list. a list of Americans and people outside of the country who were forbidden from traveling on airplanes because of fear of 9/11. And teach them that the majority of people on that initial no-fly list were people who had names that sounded like Muslim names. Right? So when we teach about the political conditions and the policies that stem from 9/11, teach a complex US history so that our students understand what has happened in these last 20 years. And we have to teach about the foreign policy because that's part of the standards of learning. It's very difficult to say this today on August the 18th in the year 2021, knowing what we're seeing and bearing witness to these days, particularly in Afghanistan. But we know that the war in Afghanistan began 20 years ago, stemming from 9/11 responses. We know that the war in Iraq stemmed from 9/11. So as we make visible to our students the global response and Americans' foreign policy decisions, we make visible to them the connections between the attack on 9/11 and our foreign policy decisions that stemmed afterwards. But I also want to remind us that we teach social emotional learning. This is what we teach every day of the academic year, and we're going to be required to mobilize all of our best resources to teach social emotional learning on 9/11 this year. This requires us to teach how to respond to social and emotional situations that exist in our classroom environment and in our larger community. So as teachers prepare SEL lessons, they're often thinking about the class environment, larger community, and being able to support students making good responses to those situations. But also teaching social emotional learning is about teaching on the defense. We have to be ready to respond to the social and the emotional needs of our students. And remind ourselves that in Virginia, particularly, we have children who are from military families. Be mindful of the emotional and social needs of those students as we approach 9/11. Think about the children of families of first responders and how those students show up on 9/11 emotionally and socially. Think about the children in our classroom who may have relatives that were lost on 9/11 or relatives that survived. Think about the students in the classroom who have personal or community fears for their safety and their existence because of the racism and the bigotry that stemmed from 9/11 and is likely to erupt on the 20th anniversary. And think about all the ways that the social media outlets are going to be having these conversations about 9/11 and how our students socially and emotionally respond to what they see and read online. We need to be prepared for multiple emotional responses in our classroom. So use morning meetings to share, as we always should be doing, but make sure that we create space for students to share how they feel. Create opportunities for students to journal so that they can reflect on their feelings privately. And as you read those journals, you can respond meaningfully to the needs that those students reveal. Include student voice in our classroom instruction. Let the students tell us what they want to learn. Let the students help shape what we discuss and how we respond on that day. Facilitate meaningful classroom relationships. Know your students and know when you need to be involved with a stronger arm to facilitate classroom relationships that are safe, that foster belonging, that don't reproduce racist discourse in the classroom. And you can only do this when you listen to your students. Listen often, because our students will tell us what they need from us as their educators. Now, I wouldn't be a teacher without naming non-examples. So although the body of my conversation today, I want to focus on culturally responsive and inclusive teaching practices, I need to name what happens in classrooms that are harmful. It is harmful if a teacher creates a tense classroom environment to teach about 9/11. If you try and scare students into paying attention, or bully them or frighten them or make them feel like this moment must be tense in order for them to learn, that's not a way for students to learn effectively. It doesn't respond to their own social and emotional needs to feel safe in your classroom. Don't reduce 9/11 instruction to death counts and fear mongering. It's not about memorizing how many lives were lost. It's not about reproducing fear of what if we have a 9/11 again. Those will be harmful and damaging to the needs of our students. Don't approach your lesson planning that your students have emotional distance from 9/11 just because of their age. Some of our students may be emotionally very close to this content. So don't begin with an assumption of distance, thinking that your instruction needs to teach students how to respond emotionally to 9/11. And although I am a strong proponent of multi-faith literacy in our schools, using 9/11 to begin teaching your class about the religion of Islam or people who are Muslims is highly inappropriate because it creates a false equivalence that 9/11 is about Islam or that 9/11 is about Muslims. Do not use this day to amplify the extremists themselves, and don't use the day to amplify their acts of 9/11. You name what happened and that's it. There's no need to further describe it, embellish it, name them, provide details. That's not relevant to what our students need. And I only named this next concern because one of the students in my study said that this is what she experienced in her classroom. Do not demand students to stand and condemn 9/11. That is highly inappropriate. Do not identify students who are Muslim or perceived to be Muslim and expect them to condemn 9/11 as if that's their responsibility because of their identity. There is no need for that. If you need to see the research of other Muslim organizations that have condemned 9/11, go online and read those condemnations yourself. But our students do not need to do that, and they don't need to do that performatively in front of the class. Don't fail to respond to anti-Muslim racism. If a student reports that they have been subjected to bullying in the classroom, racist discourse, comments that cause them to feel uncomfortable, respond. Don't ignore it. Don't pretend it didn't happen. Don't dismiss it as something that they must have misunderstood. Respond and act appropriately. And don't reproduce a single American narrative that there's only one way to understand 9/11, one way to make sense of it, because that will serve to marginalize all the other students in your classroom and in larger society that have very complex understandings of this day and what this day means to them and their communities. Now, I'm not an art teacher, never have been, not the creative one in the room, but I will say that art creates a beautiful opening for teaching about 9/11. This piece of art that I'm showing on the screen is painted on a mural in Portland, Oregon. Unfortunately, if you remember, in the year 2017, there was a violent act of Islamophobia on an Amtrak train. But as a response to that act, this mural was born. Know them, only us. Think about what this art is communicating. Think about the social messages of inclusion and unity that stem from a horrific incident, and how you can use art in your classroom to inspire students to create as a result of 9/11, to move them emotionally to the next steps of healing and unity and coming togetherness. The second piece of art is from the 9/11 Memorial and Museum website. I highly encourage you to look at that website. Great lessons, great resources, beautiful art. This is a photograph that was taken of a mural in New York City. People had inscribed on it messages after 9/11, and then someone had painted over that this image that has the word courage boldly placed in the middle. It reminds us of the stories of heroism, survival, and resilience that stemmed from 9/11. Have your students use this as a moment to create art in a way that brings your community as a class together at the start of a school year. When they see the rest of the nation having very difficult discourse about 9/11, allow their art to redirect us as a nation to what we need to be centering when we talk about 9/11. Art has a beautiful way of communicating in ways that words simply fall short with. So I had invited you to engage in some self-reflection with me. This is part of our professional development protocol. So let's lean into this learning community here. I have on the screen 4 prompts, and I'd invite you to choose one of these 4. And I'm going to make the room quiet for 3 minutes to allow you to write and reflect individually on one of these 4 prompts. The first is that language matters. So I encourage you, write a 2 to 3 sentence script that names what happened on 9/11. Refrain from harmful terminology. Like I said, going into a classroom to teach about this day cold without thinking of your words in advance can be really hard. So write a script now. What are you going to say to the students that you're responsible for teaching? Or number 2, the Muslim American impact. Can you describe how 9/11 has impacted the Muslim American community? For some of you on this call, you may not have been familiar with some of these impacts. So now, how would you describe them? Or take number 3, I'm calling it America, America. Can you narrate a 9/11 story of resilience or heroism or hope that centers a marginalized community? Or number 4, listen to the students. So can you plan what would be an effective strategy to listen to your students' social emotional needs the week of 9/11? Like, what are you actually going to do? And as the bonus, plan how to process your own adult emotional responses that week. I think that when we go into a difficult situation with the plan, we're more likely to come out successful. So these 3 minutes may seem long, but for those of us that are educators, we know the importance of wait time. And I know the power of reflection. So please join me in taking 3 minutes to reflect, and then I'll come back off of mute in 3 minutes to speak about how we move forward from this. Thank you. Thank you for taking that time. Thank you for engaging in reflection. This is an important strategy for educators. It helps us be ready. It helps us plan. It helps us to be effective as instructors. This is not nearly enough time to truly reflect on these different prompts. So I encourage you to find and create the time to do this outside of this webinar to more fully engage in this work and this preparation. Janae, if I can ask you to post the last poll question on the screen. So I invite all of you to lean into the fact we're in a Virginia Department of Education webinar, and we've got the leaders of the Department of Education with us in this space. So we can speak to them now through this poll. Here's my question to you all. What resources would best support your ability to embody culturally responsive and inclusive teaching for 9/11? Let's tell the Department of Education what we need in order to do this work effectively, all right? And let's see what the group is looking for and be able to name this as what our next steps are to be able to do this work. We've got about just 15% of the people clicking in, so I'm going to let everybody have a chance to read the responses, click in your responses, and then I'll stop the poll and make it visible when we get to our target now is about 60%. A little bit more, we're up to 40. Give a few more people a chance to reply. What resources would best support you in doing this work for 9/11? All right, so I'm going to make this visible here. All right, so when I see this screen, the overwhelming response, we've got 76% of the room is saying suggested lesson plans and resources. Yes, I hear you. So again, let's crowdsource our work, but I will also name that I have produced, with the help of a graduate student, a list of suggested lesson plans, and I'm going to share with you the website where that list is going to be posted. You'll see that becoming live in the next couple of days. Second group, let's see, we've got 54% of the room that says professional development on Islam and Muslims. I hear you. Thank you. There is a lack of this content, but I will tell you there's a solution. Georgetown University has a research center. Their research center offers free professional development on Islam and Muslims for classroom educators. Free, right? You can't ask for anything better, right? So I'm going to show you in just a moment what that website looks like so that you know where to go and seek those resources. 49% of the room is saying they need classroom library resources. Yes, yes. Let's have Muslim characters, marginalized community members showing up in our classroom library 180 days of the year, not just on 9/11. So I'm going to show you a website where you can find some great titles to add to your classroom library and then add that to your wish list for the start of the school year. Let's see, we've got now 43% say meaningful relationships with Muslims in area communities. Yes, yes. The research is so clear. When we know somebody personally, it disrupts so many of our biases, feelings of discrimination, stereotypes, and even racist discourse just by getting to know people. So I'm going to encourage you to approach Muslim organizations, invite them to partner with you in your schools. Look for opportunities to get to know the Muslims in your school community as individuals. By building meaningful relationships, we truly get to know one another. And I'm going to give you some ideas of how you can do that strategically. Revise standards of learning. Yes, I agree. If the standards of learning were revised to include more culturally responsive terminology, it would make it easier to teach this way for 9/11. But I also want to challenge you here. Standards of learning, though I know they're being revised this year for the history and the social studies, the way they stand now is strong. It offers us strong references of focusing on change, examination, communication of information. We have a strong body that tells us there is a wide understanding of what needs to be taught on 9/11. So we can use that as a foundation for then what we need to build into our lessons. And then there's only 11% that say they need professional incentives, which sounds like a room full of educators, right? You're not seeking incentives often for doing the good work that you do, but nevertheless, we should have incentives in our classrooms and in our schools for people who do model effective education. So please pay attention to your colleagues who are doing this right and make sure that their efforts are made more visible to the leadership in your building or in your districts. But I'd like to share with you, because I said we were going to end with sharing resources. So let me hold my own and share some resources with all of you. Let's read the screen here from top left down to bottom right. All right, so top left, you see a logo for an organization I highly encourage and support you to pay attention to. It's called Shoulder to Shoulder. This is an organization that has its mission to disrupt anti-Muslim racism and Islamophobia by having multi-faith coordinations and partnerships across the nation. They are currently involved in a 4-week training on culturally responsive teaching for centering Muslim students and Muslim learners. So the work that they're producing is phenomenal. And if you're looking to be in community with people who are looking to disrupt racism around this country, I encourage you to check out Shoulder to Shoulder if you're not familiar with them already. Then you have a beautiful image of a cute little girl spinning that basketball on her finger, sporting her headscarf, and that is a book cover. There is a website called Common Sense Media. I hope you've heard of it. But if you go to Common Sense Media and search by Muslims or Islam, you're going to get a list of recommended titles for different age groups that center Muslim characters. Bring those books into your classroom all year long. It serves to help disrupt racism when students are able to see and read about communities that are their own or that may be different from their own. This is the best practice of culturally responsive and inclusive teaching. And then look in the middle of the screen. I told you, Georgetown University, the ACMCU Center, if you go to that website, you search by their programs. I'm representing on the screen the modules that they teach for professional development. Again, their resources are free. Who wouldn't want to use free professional development resources? On the right side, that's a compilation of books. These are recommended readings for people to learn more about Muslims or Islam. This list was compiled by the organization at the bottom right of the screen, and it's also the organization that produces so many of the fabulous statistics that I'm able to cite in my presentation today. The Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. If you're not familiar with them, highly encourage you to dig into their website and look at the wealth of resources that they produce to help you better understand Muslims, Americans, and statistical representations of this particular community. And then in the center of the screen, you see an image of a mosque. It's the Islamic Society of Central Virginia. They're naming themselves as the first masjid in historic Charlottesville, Virginia. Awesome. But mosques and Muslim community centers are places that are interested in building relationships with the larger community so that we can disrupt and break down these divisions that simply serve to reproduce racism in our larger society. So for those of you that were looking to get more information on how to disrupt anti-Muslim racism, how to get to know more about Muslims or Islam, I'm hoping that these references and these opportunities here give you some good ideas of where you can find more. So in closing, I'd like to name 3 things for all of you as we wrap up this conversation of advancing culturally responsive and inclusive teaching for 9/11 lessons. 1, teaching is a political act. There's no other way to say it. When we look at the root word political, don't just go in this binary of Republican and Democrat that we hear in our larger discourse today. Remind yourself of the original roots of the word political. It is a communication of beliefs and values. Teaching is a communication of our beliefs and our values. And our students receive that communication and it impacts our larger society. That's why, excuse me, with all the ways that we can seek to change the world, I choose to be involved in education because teaching allows us to change the world. 2, teach students how to commemorate 9/11. Don't leave it to students to figure out. Lean into this as a teachable moment. You organize the instruction. You name what they need to know about this day. Make it broader than the 24 hours or even the minutes that involve just the planes crashing on the buildings. Teach students the stories of America that emerged from 9/11. And that will name for our students how they should commemorate this day in history. And lastly, when doing this work, acknowledge that anti-Muslim racism is real. It exists in our federal policies. It exists in our workplaces. It exists in larger society. It exists in our communities. It exists in our schools. When we can acknowledge it and make it visible, then we can challenge it, confront it, disrupt it, and just end it. So as you construct your lesson plans to commemorate the 20th anniversary of 9/11, recommit yourself to advancing the work that is necessary to disrupt racism in all of its forms. I thank you again for making this space possible. I'm putting on the screen here an email address you can use to reach out to me. I welcome your feedback and continued conversation. I'm giving you my Twitter handle that you can reach out to me for more information. And then the website that is going to house several resources that I think will be helpful for you. One, the document that is going to compile the 9/11 teaching lesson plans and resources that's going to be housed at this webpage. Second, I've created a 40-minute professional development video for teachers who want to teach about 9/11 in a way that disrupts anti-Muslim racism. I encourage you to view that training video. It's on YouTube, circulate it widely. And Janae, I'm going to stop sharing and see if there are any questions that I can entertain from the room.
Thank you so much, Dr. DeCure, for such a comprehensive presentation. I certainly learned a great deal, and I'm really grateful for the resources that you shared. I know that educators across the state are really interested in how to embed culturally responsive practices into their everyday teaching. And so I certainly will be sharing these a little bit more widely as well from my platform. So I'm really appreciative of that. There are a few questions, as well as some comments that I wanted to address. Many of these questions I already responded to, Dr. DeCure, so I just want to actually reiterate them out loud, just because I think it'll be useful for the rest of the group as well. So just bear with me here for just a second. So somebody was asking a question about what should 9/11 lessons include? What should they mention? What aspects of what happened that day should be mentioned? I just want to be clear that the standards around 9/11 are there for your reference. Those describe the Commonwealth's expectations for students' learning and achievement. That should be the basis for how these conversations are handled and discussed. Curriculum, on the other hand, describes the full scope of student experiences that occur in the educational process. So in other words, how students meet those expectations outlined in the standards of learning. That is determined at the local level. There's a great deal of flexibility around how these ideas and concepts are taught to students. So you certainly can be responsive to the students in your classrooms, understanding their backgrounds and how that should be what really drives how you approach your lesson. So just something to keep in mind. And next here, and just bear with me, y'all, because I'm reading and trying to facilitate at the same time. And so there was a question about, should the current events in Afghanistan be included in this year's conversation around 9/11 or not? And Dr. DeCure, I would love your response on that. I responded to this person just with my understanding of culturally responsive teachers. And culturally responsive teachers bring real world issues into the classroom. I think we would be absolutely remiss to think that what's happening in students' real lives currently, and we are all experiencing what's going on in world news, I think we would be remiss to think that those conversations won't spill over into our schools and classrooms. And so it's really important that teachers are equipped and ready and prepared to facilitate those conversations. So I would certainly say that it is more than relevant to bring those conversations up, but I do think that there's a certain level of nuance there. So I want Dr. DeCure to come on and provide her thoughts there as well.
So I think that we lean in to focusing on humanity and humanization of people and communities. So if we're going to address 9/11 in a culturally responsive framework, and we're going to acknowledge and be aware of the difficult situations that are existing within Afghanistan today, I think that we need to focus more on the people and less on a policy analysis of this day on 9/11. The 9/11 lesson plan itself is going to have a beginning and an end, right? We're going to be teaching that 9/11 lesson in the context of a class period or a span of time in the course of a school day. And so if we're going to use that one lesson to talk about 9/11, I would want it to be heavily centered on humanity, on our common humanity, on stories of America. And when we talk about the war in Afghanistan and the current realities of Afghanistan, focus on the people. Focus on the people, because the sensitivity that you bring to this moment is an understanding that there could be students in your classroom whose family, friends, relatives are directly impacted by the state of current state of affairs in Afghanistan today. So no, we don't ignore it. Yes, we acknowledge it. Yes, we make those connections visible, but lean into making visible the common humanity of the people who are involved in these difficult situations.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. DeCure. And the next question, you actually kind of touched on this in your presentation, but I just would love for you to reiterate this. This person asked, would September 11th or a lesson around September 11th be an opportunity to teach geography lessons or world religion lessons? You started discussing this, and I would love for you to expand a little bit about your thoughts there and why that could be inappropriate.
Yeah, I think that as teachers, when we organize a lesson plan, it's a communication of what is important to students. It helps students understand what they need to be held accountable to in terms of learning and what is relevant as they're building bridges to better understand whatever it is we're teaching. So if we begin and end and include in a conversation on 9/11, world geography and a conversation about world religions, we are creating and reproducing a false equivalence that world religions are responsible for the devastation of 9/11, or world religions are the precursors to the devastation of 9/11. And I would want us to segregate and separate those out clearly and distinctly for our students. At the same time, yes, our students need to be globally aware. Yes, they need to have world geography. They need to understand world religions. But I'm talking specifically the lesson that focuses on 9/11 and keeping that lesson free from the reproduction of the stereotypes and the biases that suggest that religion, world religions, world geography are necessary to better understanding the importance of the significant date in our history. So I think it's just important of what we plan in the lesson, and then when we teach the other content at other times in the year. Again, use those students' messages from the very beginning of my presentation. When those conversations start getting into countries that have Muslim majority populations, and students begin to give a student in the classroom that side eye of, isn't that where your family is from? Or isn't that the language that you speak at home? Then we find ourselves being in a situation where our lesson is reproducing those biases.
Thank you so much, Dr. DeCure. And I actually just realized that we are about 12 minutes over our end time for this webinar, but not to worry. There is just one more question. And this question was actually asked early on in your presentation when you were talking about your research findings. And so I think you have to apply that context to it. But so I think it's less about that 9/11 lesson and just thinking about student emotional needs. But do you feel that the current state of affairs in Afghanistan will create more difficulties for Muslim students this year on 9/11? So not necessarily related to the lesson in and of itself, but.
Yes. And that's what it means to be a culturally responsive teacher, right? We have to lean into socio-culturally awareness. So that means we need to be aware of the surroundings that are influencing our students. So yes, what is happening in Afghanistan is creating emotional stress on all of the families in this country, in this state, that claim Afghanistan as their home community. But Muslims broadly are also mourning these difficult situations. The world community is mourning these difficult situations that exist in Afghanistan. So yes, our students are likely to come into this school year, come into the week of 9/11 with this emotional toll. So be aware of it so that we can respond accordingly in a way that supports our students, all of our students.
And thank you so much for all of your responses and for this amazing presentation, Dr. DeCure. I do want to mention that I do a lot of these webinars, and I have to say that the inclusion of those prompts that promote that discussion and that reflection, I really appreciated those. And that we did get some comments in the Q&A that also talked to how useful they were for our audience today. So thank you so much for that. Before we head off, and conclude today, I do want to just make everyone aware of our next webinar, which will be taking place on, one second, let me get my slides up for y'all. It'll be taking place on August 24th, and it's going to be about supporting transgender students. As you know, schools are responsible for aligning to model transgender policies as mandated by law. And so we are providing this webinar to just provide some support to educators and best practices for supporting transgender students in our schools to ensure their safety and full inclusion in Virginia public schools. And so please join us for that. We will also be joined by our policy director, who will talk a little bit about that legislative mandate and schools requirements as it pertains to that. If you have questions about that, do not hesitate to join us. And if you can't join the webinar, we are always available in the Office of Equity and Community Engagement here at DOE. Our email is edequityva@doe.virginia.gov. If you have any questions pertaining to this topic in particular, feel free to reach out to us there. You can follow us on social media on Twitter, and our hashtag is #EdEquityVA. And by viewing that, you'll see the latest from the field. Thank you all so much for joining us. Again, thank you so much to Dr. DeCure for joining us to present on this topic. We really appreciate your time and your sharing of expertise and resources. Everything that she shared today on this live webinar, I will make available to everyone that has registered today by email. I will follow up an email with the recording, with the resources, as well as the slide presentation. So again, thank you all so much for hanging out with us here this afternoon for this valuable professional learning, and we will see you here next time. Thank you all. Thank you again, Dr. DeCure.